Okay, let's dive in. Imagine your life feels pretty, well, ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
You're on your regular commute, maybe on a crowded subway, right? Lost in the world of a story on your phone, just trying to get through the day.
Yeah, the daily grind.
Mundane, predictable, maybe even a little lonely.
Yeah.
Then, like, without warning, the world you thought you knew doesn't just change, it screeches to a halt.
Literally.
Literally. The lights plunge you into darkness, the train shakes with this violent metallic shriek, and you hear the most impossible, chilling announcement.
And it's not the conductor, is it?
No way. It's a voice that feels cold, digital, utterly alien. The free service of Planetary System 8620 has been terminated. The main scenario has started.
Wow.
In that instant, the quiet, ordinary reality you inhabited just shatters.
It's an opening designed to just seize you, isn't it? That abrupt, almost whiplash-inducing transition from the utterly mundane, the commute, the anonymous crowded subway car, to something straight out of the most impossible high-stakes fiction. This single moment, delivered with the cold finality of, like, a service notification, is the hook that tells you everything you understood about reality is wrong, and a terrifying new set of rules has just been put in place.
It absolutely does. It's the perfect embodiment of the show's premise, and that's exactly what we're here to unpack today. We are embarking on a deep, deep dive into the absolute starting point of the web novel Omniscient reader's Viewpoint.
Just the very beginning.
Our source material is just the very first chapter, Episode 1, Part 1.
And our mission is to take this foundational text, right, the very first impression the story gives you, and explore every significant sentence, every seemingly small detail.
Every single one.
We want to understand not just what the text states factually, but its emotional weight, the thematic threads, its signals right from the jump, its narrative purpose.
What it tells us about the characters before the action even starts.
Any relevant cultural context, and crucially, what the author is doing here. You know, what was the specific intention behind starting this massive, complex story exactly this way?
Well,
Every word in a first chapter is a deliberate choice, a promise of foundation.
absolutely. So as we go through this, pay close attention to how the everyday, the deeply relatable mundane is deliberately contrasted with the utterly fantastical.
That contrast is key.
Listen for those subtle early hints about our protagonist's unique perspective hints that seem insignificant in the real-world context but become, well, everything in the next moment. And mark that moment, that sudden, dramatic shift at the end of the chapter that doesn't just change the plot, but completely redefines the nature of reality itself.
Because this opening chapter is the essential foundation. It's not just exposition. It immediately establishes the core metafictional premise that drives the entire series, this idea that reality can become a narrative.
Right. Yeah.
It introduces crucial character dynamics right from the get-go, showing you who our protagonist is and how he sees himself and others before the world changes.
Which is so important.
And it immediately plunges you, the reader or listener, into the central conflict and the incredibly high stakes of this terrifying new world. Everything that happens in the subsequent chapters is a direct consequence of what unfolds and is established in these first few pages.
It really is.
Think of it as, like, the launch sequence for a rocket you didn't know you were on. If you miss the details here, you miss why the journey even began and why our particular protagonist is the one who might just survive it.
Right. So let's jump right into that launch sequence. The very first lines introduce our protagonist, Kim Dokja, and immediately there's something unique about his name. The source text begins, "I'm Dokja."
And the author immediately provides this crucial parenthetical, doesn't he? It says, Dokja can mean only son or reader.
Yeah, right there.
This isn't just an introduction. It's the author handing you a puzzle piece, a key to the character's identity and potential role, right at the beginning. His name, Dokja, is a loaded term in Korean, carrying this dual meaning.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Only son.
Only son immediately suggests solitude, maybe a unique or solitary fate, perhaps even the burden of being the sole inheritor of something.
Yeah, of alone.
But the other meaning, reader, is absolutely foundational, almost prophetic for this specific narrative. It positions his identity around the consumption of stories.
And we immediately see how that name functions in the real world in just like normal social interactions. The text says, "I usually introduce myself to people like this, then the following misunderstanding would occur. Oh, are you an only child? I am, but that isn't what I mean. Huh. Then. My name is Dokja. Kim Dokja."
It's a perfect little microcosm of his social experiences.
Totally.
Precisely. It shows that his core identity, the one tied to the deeper meaning of his name, the reader aspect, is constantly misunderstood or overlooked in conventional social settings.
People hear only child.
Exactly. They hear the more common, mundane meaning, the realism interpretation. They don't hear reader, the unconventional, potentially symbolic meaning that is truly significant to his impending story. It primes us for a character whose true nature, whose essential defining trait, isn't immediately apparent to others in the everyday world. It hints that the most important thing about him is something others consistently miss.
It's incredibly deliberate for the author to choose to start the entire novel with this specific interaction and this linguistic nuance.
Oh, absolutely.
It signals immediately that names, identity, and interpretation, whether it's interpreting a name or interpreting a story, are going to be absolutely central themes. How we define ourselves, how others perceive us based on labels and meanings, and the deeper significance hidden within those labels is crucial from page 1.
And in literary terms, right, when an author gives a character a name with inherent symbolism, it's a direct signal, often a heavy-handed one, to the reader about that character's role or nature.
Like a flashing sign.
Pretty much. Here, the dual meaning of Dokja doesn't just add depth. It immediately establishes a meta-narrative layer. Is he defined by his solitary existence as an only son, potentially isolated? Or is he defined by his passive but dedicated consumption of stories as a reader?
And the story seems to say both.
The novel will argue that these are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, his solitude, only son, might be precisely what allowed him to become the specific kind of reader he is one uniquely positioned to survive. This isn't just subtle character naming, it's the author explicitly laying out one of the core premises. Names have power, understanding meaning is key, and perceived isolation can hide a potent strength.
The source text continues to build this picture of his self-perception. Kim Dokja, Kim highly respected only son. My father gave me that name to be a strong man by myself. However, thanks to the name my father gave me, I turned out to be just a normal, single, and lonely man.
And here is where that irony really deepens. His father's intention behind the name Dokja, especially in the only son sense, implying focus, a singular path, maybe self-reliance, was aspirational. He wanted his son to be a strong man by himself.
But Dokja sees it differently.
Yeah, he perceives his reality as the opposite of strength. He sees himself as merely normal, single, and lonely. This immediately introduces a theme of destiny versus perceived reality, or intention versus outcome. His name was meant to be a foundation for strength and independence, but in the mundane realism of his life, he feels it has only served to underline his isolation and lack of conventional success. It's a powerful, melancholic note right at the start, hinting that perhaps his true strength will manifest not in the way his father intended, within the confines of conventional society.
But somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. In a context where being by himself and being a reader are not liabilities, but assets.
That self-deprecating tone is incredibly strong from the very beginning. He clearly sees himself through a lens of ordinariness, perhaps even failure, defining himself by his solitude and lack of conventional markers of success. He's 28, single, lonely.
Right.
His identity, in his own eyes, is shaped by what he isn't, according to typical societal benchmarks. He's not a career success, not in a relationship, not surrounded by friends.
This establishes him as the relatable, seemingly unremarkable protagonist, which is absolutely crucial for the genre tropes the novel is playing with. He isn't presented as the born hero, the physically imposing figure, the charismatic leader, or the genius scientist.
No, he's a guy.
He's the quiet guy you might not notice. His key defining trait, introduced immediately after his age and relationship status, solidifies this image of the overlooked individual.
My hobby was reading web novels on the subway.
And this is the seemingly insignificant detail that the entire story pivots on. This quiet, passive activity, often seen as a form of escapism or procrastination in the real world, is framed here as his core identity trait, placed right alongside his name and marital status. Emphasize the contrast, the mundane setting of a noisy, crowded, perhaps smelly subway car, versus the extraordinary content he's consuming, the vast, fantastical worlds contained within web novels on a small screen. This hobby, this personal world he inhabits during his commute, is about to become the most important thing about him, the very key to survival. This is where the novel immediately signals its genre subversion. In so many fantasy or action stories, the protagonist is chosen because of their lineage, a prophecy, an inherent magical ability, or years of intense training, right?
Right, the usual tropes.
Dokja's special skill, his source of power in the coming chaos, is literally just reading. It's a passive, solitary, and completely undervalued activity in the context of his realism life.
Yeah, nobody thinks reading on the train is going to save the world.
Exactly. The novel immediately signals that this overlooked skill, this solitary dedication to consuming fiction, is the key to surviving the fantastical reality that is about to hit. It positions him not as a typical chosen one defined by innate talent or destiny, but as an accidentally, perhaps uniquely qualified survivor whose critical advantage comes from dedicated, solitary consumption of stories.
It's like the author is looking right at you, the listener.
The author is telling you, the reader scrolling through this story or listening to this deep dive, that your hobby, your solitary escape into fictional worlds, might just be the most important thing about you, too. It elevates the act of reading itself to a form of potent, life-saving knowledge.
Okay, let's just quickly micro-recap this first bit. We've established Kim Dokja's core identity, defined by his name's double meaning connecting reader and only son.
Right, the solitude and the storytelling are linked from the start.
We see how he perceives himself as a lonely, normal guy, his defining characteristic being his seemingly insignificant hobby of reading web novels on the subway.
And this self-perception is crucial because it's built within the framework of the realism genre he believes he inhabits, and it contrasts sharply with what's coming.
Remember this, Dokja isn't just a name, it's a thematic statement. His reading, the quiet act of consuming stories, is presented as his seemingly mundane yet secretly powerful defining characteristic.
And we have that vivid image, right? Him, just one person among many, lost in the glow of his phone screen on the noisy, anonymous subway. A scene incredibly relatable to modern life, where personal worlds are accessed via small devices, even in crowded public spaces.
Absolutely. That contrast between the external, shared, mundane reality of the subway and the internal, solitary, extraordinary world of the web novel is fundamental.
And that contrast, that collision between the external and internal, between perceived reality and fictional worlds, starts to manifest in a very small, mundane way with the introduction of another character into his immediate space on that subway.
Right, Yoo Sangah appears. The source text describes it. Then I'll go on my smartphone. In a noisy subway, I raised my head reflexively. A pair of curious eyes were staring straight at me. They belonged to an employee from the human resources team, Yoo Sangah.
Ah, the dreaded colleague encounter outside work.
Exactly. Hello? Are you going home from work? Yes. What about Yoo Sangah? I was lucky. The manager went on a business trip today. Yoo Sangah sat down soon as the seat next to me became vacant. A subtle scent came from her shoulders, making me nervous.
It's such a grounded, slice-of-life moment, isn't it? The universal experience of an awkward encounter, the small talk about the commute and office life.
Even the detail of her scent making him nervous.
Yeah. It firmly roots the beginning of the chapter in that realism genre we just discussed. It's relatable, slightly uncomfortable, and utterly mundane.
And it immediately introduces Yoo Sangah, who is presented in distinct contrast to Dokja. His nervousness around her ties back directly to his self-perception as single and lonely, someone perhaps not adept at conventional social interactions.
Right, maybe uncomfortable around someone who embodies conventional appeal or success.
Exactly. She represents a kind of conventional success or desirability within the workplace and social hierarchy that he feels alienated from.
And her comment about being lucky because the manager is away subtly hints at her importance, her status, or at least her ease in navigating the social and professional world with a grace that Dokja seems to lack or actively avoids.
It sets up this dynamic, this perceived difference between them even before the world changes. It's the quiet, solitary person running into the seemingly successful, well-adjusted, popular colleague.
It's a common human experience, elevated here to serve a narrative purpose. And this interaction directly leads to the introduction of one of the novel's core metafictional concepts.
Okay, yeah. The source text continues this exchange. Do you normally take the subway? That. Yoo Sangah made a dark expression. Come to think of it, this was the first time I'd met Yoo Sangah on a subway train.
So immediately something's different.
Yeah. And Dokja thinks, starting with personnel manager Kang to finance manager Han, there were rumors that Yoo Sangah had men from the company driving her home every workday.
Office gossip.
The cornerstone of realism, yet unexpected words came from Yoo Sangah's mouth. Someone stole my bicycle.
Bicycle, okay.
Bicycle. You commute by bike? Yes. I have a lot of overtime these days and seem to be lacking exercise. It is a bit annoying, but it is worth doing. Aha, I see.
This adds fascinating layers. Dokja's internal knowledge, based on office gossip, paints a picture of Yoo Sangah as someone potentially navigating complex social dynamics, perhaps benefiting from male attention, presenting a certain kind of conventional realism drama.
Right, the kind of story he isn't in.
But her stated reality is far more down to earth. A stolen bicycle forcing her onto the subway. This contrast between the rumored reality and the stated reality is interesting.
It shows he's paying attention, though.
It shows Dokja's observational side. He's aware of the office rumor mill, even if he positions himself outside of it. And Yoo Sangah's bicycle story, while seemingly minor, adds a layer of relatable realism to her character. She commutes by bike. She's trying to fit exercise into a busy, overtime-heavy schedule.
Makes her seem normal? Proactive?
It paints her as disciplined, proactive, and health-conscious. It is worth doing. Which contrasts directly with Dokja's passive hobby of reading. It positions her as conventionally good at the realism game, making an effort.
It feels like a very specific detail designed to make her relatable, to ground her in the everyday, even while the rumors hint at something more conventionally dramatic. And Dokja's internal reaction to the gossip, even while feeling like an outsider, reveals that he is paying attention to the social world, even if he feels he's not a part of it or that its rules don't apply to him in the same way.
Exactly. And then we get to the truly pivotal lines, the ones that explicitly state the novel's central framework.
Yoo Sangah smiled. Looking closer at her, I could understand the feelings men held toward her. However, it was none of my business. Every person had a genre of life, and Yoo Sangah was someone who lived a genre different from myself.
Boom. There it is. Every person had a genre of life.
This line isn't just a nice turn of phrase. This is the novel explicitly revealing its core operating system before the system itself appears in the world.
Yeah. Dokja isn't just thinking about stories. He's using the fundamental language and structure of stories genre to categorize and understand real life and the people within it. This line is absolutely critical to understanding Dokja's perspective and the entire premise. It tells us that Dokja already perceives and interprets the world through a narrative lens. He sees his own life as realism, mundane, lacking drama, predictable, with himself as a clear non-protagonist.
Right. He's stuck in the boring genre.
And he sees Yoo Sangah's life as belonging to a different, distinct genre, implicitly more exciting, conventionally successful, perhaps like a romance, a corporate drama, or a slice of life where she is clearly a central, appealing character.
He draws a line between them.
He erects a conceptual boundary between their genres, believing their life paths are fundamentally different and that her narrative rules don't apply to him nor his to her. This establishes his perspective as someone who doesn't just read stories, but understands narrative structures, character archetypes, and plot conventions, applying this understanding to the world around him. This cognitive framework is what will give him his unique power.
So he's looking at her, acknowledging her conventional appeal, the kind of person who would be the romantic lead or the successful career woman in a different kind of story, and thinking not just she's different from me, but specifically she's a character in a different genre than I am.
Exactly. It's a specific narrative-driven way of seeing the world.
Wow.
And the author's using this internal thought, this application of a metafictional concept, to mundane reality, to explicitly signal the central thematic conflict of the novel. The story is literally about what happens when these perceived different genres collide, when Dokja's seemingly static realism is violently invaded by the fantasy genre he only knows from the pages of a book.
Which is about to happen.
Very soon. It sets up his unique ability to navigate the coming chaos. He's the only one who's already been analyzing life as a story, who understands the underlying structures and tropes.
Okay, and so I'll pause here for a second, micro recap. We've been introduced to Kim Dokja, understood how his name's double meaning of reader and only son is central to his identity and perceived solitude.
The reader alone.
We've seen how he views himself as a lonely, normal guy, defined by his seemingly insignificant web novel hobby. And we've just explored his encounter with Yoo Sangah on the subway, who he immediately categorizes as belonging to a different genre of life.
Compared to his own perceived realism, she's conventional success, appeal, proactivity.
Right. This self-categorization and the contrast it creates sets the stage for the dramatic shift to come. Remember, Dokja, reader-only son, sees himself as fundamentally living in realism and sees Sangah as a character in a different genre altogether. This internal framing is key.
And picture that image. The subtle scent from her shoulders, something grounding and real, contrasting with the stale, anonymous air of the subway car, while Dokja internally categorizes her into a whole different narrative world.
Okay, so this genre distinction, this perceived difference in their fundamental narrative realities, continues to shape their awkward subway conversation.
It really does.
The source text continues. After the awkward conversation, we looked at our phones. I opened up the novel app I was reading on before while Yoo Sangah. What was this? Por favor, dinero. Huh. Spanish.
The classic phone retreat after awkward small talk.
So relatable. Dokja asks, I see. What does it mean? Please give me some money, Yoo Sangah replied proudly. Studying on the subway while going home, she truly had a genre different from me. However, what was the use of memorizing words? You're working hard.
Here we see another layer of contrast in how they use their time and technology, right? Dokja immediately retreats back into his fictional world on his phone, his escape, his solitary pursuit.
It's his comfort zone.
Yoo Sangah, on the other hand, is actively engaged in studying Spanish phrases. This reinforces the different genres they inhabit, or at least that Dokja perceives them to inhabit. She is engaged in tangible, conventional self-improvement aimed at career advancement.
Getting ahead in the realism world.
A very realism pursuit with clear, practical goals. He is passively consuming fiction and escape from the demands and pressures of that realism world.
And Dokja's internal reaction to her studying is really telling, revealing his underlying perspective. Studying on the subway while going home, she truly had a genre different from me. However, what was the use of memorizing words?
Oof, that hits.
He acknowledges her effort, but there's a definite note of cynicism, a sense that he feels these conventional efforts, studying languages, climbing the corporate ladder, seeking tangible skills, are perhaps ultimately futile.
Or at least less valuable or relevant than, well, whatever it is he's doing with his web novels.
Yeah.
This isn't just Dokja being dismissive. It's dramatic irony building. His seemingly useless reading is about to become the only truly valuable skill. His cynicism about conventional preparation hints that he senses, consciously or unconsciously, that the rules of the game he's currently playing aren't the only or the most important ones.
What was the use of memorizing words? Run speaks volumes about his detachment from conventional markers of success and preparation.
Yeah, it suggests a belief, maybe an instinctual one given his deep immersion in fictional narratives, that the skills valued by the current realism system aren't the ones that will ultimately matter. It adds complexity to his self-perception as outside the mainstream genre. He's not just failing at it, he's questioning its fundamental value.
Then she turns the question on him, bringing his world into the conversation. By the way, what is Dokja looking at? Yoo Sangah's gaze was fixed on the LCD screen of my smartphone. Is it a novel? Yes, well, I'm studying Korean.
Oh no, the cover-up. His immediate defensiveness and his slightly awkward attempt to reframe his hobby as studying Korean is highly significant.
Why does he do that?
It highlights the perceived social stigma attached to his specific form of reading web novels, often considered lowbrow or mere entertainment, versus what might be considered literature or educational material.
Ah, right, the snobbery.
He feels the need to make his hobby sound academic, productive, and socially acceptable, something other than mere entertainment or solitary escape. It shows his awareness of the social hierarchy of reading material and where his preference falls within it, and his discomfort in revealing that.
And Yoo Sangah's response, while seemingly open, immediately confirms that perceived hierarchy and the difference in their reading worlds. She says, wow, I also like novels. I haven't been able to read lately because I don't have time. It was surprising. Yoo Sangah liked reading novels.
And then she lists them. Murakami Haruki, Raymond Carver, Han Kang.
Dokja thinks. I thought so.
Yeah, there it is. She professes to like novels, but immediately lists acclaimed mainstream literary authors. This confirms Dokja's internal suspicion and solidifies the distinction between their reading habits and the genres of literature they consume.
It's the difference between reading for cultural capital, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Intellectual engagement or social currency, the kind of reading she seems to do, the kind that gets discussed in certain circles, versus reading for pure entertainment, escape, or, as it turns out, survival knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of reading Dokja does.
It highlights the perceived gulf in the value and status of their respective hobbies in the real world.
And the author explicitly uses these specific, recognizable literary author names as cultural anchors, grounding the story in a very real, very relatable reality of reading habits and the often snobbish hierarchies associated with them.
He knows immediately that the kind of novels she reads are fundamentally different from his, existing in a different cultural space, a different genre of reading. And that leads to this slightly painful, awkward exchange about specific titles.
She asks, Dokja, what writers do you like? And he replies, you won't know even if I say their names.
Which is probably true.
She persists. I've read a lot of novels. Who are the authors? At this time, it was really hard to say that I read web novels as a hobby. I glanced at the title of the novel in the app, The World After the Fall author, Xing Shengsheng.
Okay, hold on. This is where the metafiction becomes incredibly layered and, for the reader, a little bit mind-bending.
Yeah, it gets wild here.
The author of Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, known as Xing Shengsheng, is writing a character, Kim Dokja, who is reading a novel within the story titled The World After the Fall. And in the story, it's ostensibly written by an author also named Xing Shengsheng, or a close variation.
It's a direct nod to the author's own previous, very real, published work, The World After the Fall, creating this deep, layered reality where the boundaries between the real author, their previous fictional work, and the current fictional story are deliberately blurred.
It's like an Easter egg for fans.
It's an inside joke for readers familiar with Xing Shengsheng's work, but it also serves to make the internal novel feel more real within the ORV universe.
So Dokja, faced with this gulf between his niche web novel world and Yoo Sangah's mainstream literary one, realizes he can't possibly say he's reading something like The World After the Fall by Xing Shengsheng to her.
No way. It's too specific, too tied to the particular web novel platform and culture that she clearly doesn't inhabit. It would only solidify his image as someone outside the conventional mainstream. So he lies.
I couldn't say that I was reading The World After the Fall by Xing Shengsheng. It is just a fantasy novel that, well, like The Lord of the Rings.
Ah, the safe comparison.
Yoo Sangah's eyes widen. Aha, Lord of the Rings, I've seen the movie. The movie is good.
This little lie isn't just about social awkwardness. It's about navigating the social judgment attached to different forms of media and different literary genres. Lord of the Rings is a safe, universally recognized fantasy touchstone.
Mostly because of the movies.
Largely due to its hugely successful mainstream movie adaptation. It allows Dokja to bridge the gap, but only barely, by referencing something she knows, even if her knowledge comes from a different medium, film, than his own source, books, web novels.
It highlights the vast difference in their cultural reference points when it comes to fiction. He knows the deep, often obscure corners of web novel culture. She knows the global blockbusters.
It absolutely solidifies that sense of them living in different worlds, belonging to different genres, even while sitting right next to each other in the same crowded subway car. They speak a different language when it comes to the stories that shape their lives.
And the author is masterfully using this common social dynamic, the awkwardness of explaining your niche hobby, the perceived hierarchy of reading material, the struggle to connect over different cultural touchstones to deepen the contrast between Dokja and Yoo Sangah, and reinforce Dokja's feeling of being an outsider in the realism genre.
His passion, his knowledge, is something he feels compelled to hide or downplay in this world, which is the ultimate delicious irony given what's about to happen.
Okay, so let's quickly recap this part of the subway ride before things get even more awkward. We've delved into the conversation where Dokja and Yoo Sangah reveal their vastly different approaches to life and literature.
She represents conventional, goal-oriented effort, studying Spanish, and mainstream literary taste, Murakami, etc., while he retreats into niche web novels, which he feels compelled to hide, even resorting to a comparison to the widely known Lord of the Rings.
This interaction cements Dokja's perception of their distinct genres and his feeling of being an outsider whose passions are undervalued in this realism world.
And the vivid image is their two phone screens glowing in the dim subway light, one displaying practical Spanish phrases, the other a fantastical web novel title symbolizing their diverging paths before reality fundamentally changes.
Remember, Dokja hides his web novel genre from Sangah's conventional genre, highlighting the social stigma and perceived value difference in their hobbies. And this conversation about novels and perceived value leads them to another awkward silence.
You know the kind, when you just run out of things to say.
Exactly. Dokja tries to break it by shifting to a safe, if slightly depressing topic: work.
The silence continued for a moment. Yoo Sangah was looking at me like she was waiting for me to say something. Our conversation was becoming strained. So I decided to change the topic. It has been a year since I joined the company. This is my last year Time moves really fast.
This is the mundane corporate reality intruding again, starkly contrasting with the fantastical worlds of web novels. Dokja brings up his impending job loss due to his contract ending.
Yeah, it's a blunt statement of a situation delivered with a sense of resigned finality. It's a significant, if depressing, realism plot point for his life before the apocalypse, the loss of his stable job.
But he immediately realizes he's made a social faux pas, highlighting his own lack of awareness of conventional career progression.
Uh-oh.
He thinks, I realized that I'd said something wrong when I saw Yoo Sangah's expression. I'd forgotten. Yoo Sangah received credit for a foreign buyer last month and was already promoted to a full-time employee.
Ouch. This underscores his detachment from the conventional workplace hierarchy and its milestones. While he was focused on the impending end of his own tenure, he'd completely overlooked her recent significant promotion.
A clear sign of her success.
Her upward trajectory within that system. It starkly underscores the difference in their career paths,
Yeah.
even within the confines of the corporate realism genre they both inhabit.
He attempts to recover, tying his situation back to his perceived lack of conventional effort. All right, my congratulations are late. I'm sorry. Haha. I should have worked hard to study a foreign language.
Which is exactly what she was doing.
Exactly. She says, no, Doc Jussie. There is still the performance review and then Dokja has this incredibly important internal thought. I hated to admit it, but the sight of Yoo Sangah talking was wonderful. It was like the world's spotlight was shining down on only one person. If this world was a novel, the protagonist would be such a person.
And this passage is absolutely fundamental to understanding Dokja's self-perception, especially regarding conventional success in narrative roles. He attributes his failure, impending job loss, directly to a lack of conventional effort, specifically citing not studying foreign languages, a direct, ironic contrast to Yoo Sangah's activity on the train.
He blames himself for not playing the game right.
He links his fate to his perceived lack of effort in playing the realism game correctly. But the truly crucial part is his internal monologue. He sees Yoo Sangah in this moment of discussing her success and offering him conventional workplace encouragement as someone bathed in a spotlight, someone who embodies the look and feel of a protagonist in a conventional story.
He explicitly states, if this world was a novel, the protagonist would be such a person.
This is a powerful, repeated metafictional moment. He is actively applying narrative analysis and character archetypes to his real life and the people in it. He sees Yoo Sangah as embodying the traits of a conventional protagonist's success, dynamism, being the center of attention, having momentum within the realism genre of their shared workplace and social circle.
And by doing so, he is consciously and explicitly positioning himself as not the protagonist of this particular story. He's the observer, the side character, the one whose contract is ending while the other gets promoted.
The one standing outside the spotlight.
Exactly.
This protagonist gaze, this habit of viewing reality through the lens of narrative tropes and roles, is central to his character and what makes him unique. He sees the world and its inhabitants in terms of roles from the stories he consumes, and in the realism story of his life, he's cast himself in the background, reserving the lead role for someone who fixed the conventional mold, like Yoo Sangah.
And this perception is key, right?
It's key, because his eventual source of power and survival in the coming world comes precisely from being an observer, a reader who knows the story from the outside looking in, rather than being a primary participant who was caught up in the conventional narrative from the start.
We can visualize this as a verbal diagram. Like, imagine two overlapping circles. One is Dokja's perceived life narrative. The other is Yoo Sangah's.
Okay.
In the overlap, the space of shared reality, like the workplace or subway, he feels sidelined, watching Yoo Sangah occupy the central space, bathed in this conceptual spotlight, symbolizing her perceived protagonist status in the realism genre they currently inhabit.
That makes sense. He continues this line of fatalistic thought about his own situation, too.
Yeah. In fact, it was the inevitable result. I hadn't tried, but Yoo Sangah made an effort. I just read novels on the internet while Yoo Sangah studied hard. It was natural that Yoo Sangah would become a full-time employee and that my contract would be terminated.
This reinforces his resigned, fatalistic view of his own situation within the realism world. He attributes his failure, his impending job termination, entirely to his perceived lack of conventional effort, explicitly contrasting his passive hobby, I just read novels on the internet,
with her visible, goal-oriented hard work, while Yoo Sangah studied hard.
The core difference in their activities, as framed by Dokja, is presented as the natural, inevitable reason for their vastly different outcomes in this specific genre of life.
Which is, as we've noted, steeped in dramatic irony for the reader who knows what's about to happen. His perceived lack of effort, in conventional terms, the reading of those novels, is about to become the single most important, most strenuous, life-saving effort he has ever made.
It sets up the fundamental ironic twist that underpins the entire novel. His greatest perceived weakness in the old world is his greatest strength in the new.
Okay. Oh, let's quickly pull together the threads from this section before we move into the chapter's climax. We've seen Dokja confront the reality of his impending job termination during an awkward conversation with Yoo Sangah, who represents conventional career success and has just been promoted.
This reinforces Dokja's self-image as a normal, unsuccessful person trapped in the realism genre. Crucially, he sees Yoo Sangah as the protagonist of this mundane reality, literally feeling like she's under a spotlight, while he is just a background character.
He attributes his fate to his perceived lack of conventional effort compared to her visible hard work, specifically highlighting his reading novels versus her studying.
The vivid imagery here is the dull, anonymous office building they both commute from and to, symbolizing the realism genre he feels stuck in, where conventional metrics of success, like promotions and job security, are the plot points he's failing at.
And where he sees others, like Yoo Sangah, succeeding, remember. Dokja's contract ending signifies his failure in the realism framework, and he explicitly labels Yoo Sangah as the realism protagonist in his mind. This resignation about his fixed place in the realism genre, this feeling of being a solo side character whose fate is inevitable, leads directly into a moment of intense internal questioning and a subtle turning point.
The source text continues. That, Dokjasi.
Yes.
If you don't mind, would you like to know the app I use?
Yoo Sangah offers him conventional help sharing her language learning app, a tool for the kind of self-improvement she's pursuing, the kind of effort he just lamented not making.
It's a genuine offer of assistance within the framework of the realism world, a potential pathway to escape his current situation.
But Dokja's reaction is one of intense dissociation. Yoo Sangah's voice momentarily became distant. It felt like the world was far away.
He's mentally retreating, overwhelmed by the stark reality of his impending job loss, her shining success, and her offer of a solution that belongs to a system, a genre, he feels fundamentally unable to succeed in.
I braced my mind and stared straight ahead. A boy was sitting in the seat opposite me on the train. He was 10 years old or so. The boy held an insect-collecting net as he sat next to his mother, laughing happily.
He describes bracing his mind, his internal world recoiling, and his gaze fixing on a seemingly random, vivid detail amidst the mundane chaos of the subway. The boy with the insect net, laughing happily with his mother.
This detail feels jarringly specific. Why this boy, this image?
It could symbolize a lost childhood innocence, a different, perhaps simpler or more adventurous path not taken, exploration, curiosity about the world, or maybe it's just a random sensory detail his dissociating mind latches onto as he contemplates fundamental questions about his life's direction and potential. It's a moment of almost poetic interruption in his bleak internal narrative.
And those fundamental questions surface explicitly in his thoughts, questions triggered by the confrontation with his reality and Yoo Sangah's contrasting path. What if I had a different life from now? I mean, what if my life genre was different?
He keeps going back to genre.
Kim Dokja. If the genre of my life wasn't realism, but fantasy, could I be the protagonist? This is it. This is the absolute core, the thesis statement of the entire novel, presented as a personal, raw, almost desperate question from the protagonist himself, just moments before it becomes reality.
This is a moment of intense, explicit narrative self-awareness. Dokja is actively contemplating the very scenario that is about to unfold. He's not just a character. He's a character who understands narrative conventions, character archetypes, and the concept of genre.
Yeah.
And in his lowest moment of perceived realism failure, he wondered if he could ever escape the confines of his current genre and fit the protagonist's mold if the story was set in a completely different one specifically, fantasy.
It's such a relatable thought for anyone who reads a lot.
It is. This thought is incredibly relatable for any reader who has ever lost themselves in a story and wondered if their own life could ever possess that kind of excitement, significance, or protagonist status. It's the author tapping into that universal desire for escapism, for narrative significance, for a life that feels less like a mundane documentary and more like an epic tale.
Thinking back to our Vogel diagram, that branching path.
Right, the one where realism leads to a dead end, job termination, and fantasy leads into the unknown.
Dokja is standing right at that junction, looking down the uncharted fantasy path and asking, with a mix of longing and disbelief, if he could be the one to walk it as the protagonist.
His answer, though, informed by his current perception of reality and delivered just moments before everything changes, is a firm rejection of the possibility, steeped in his conviction of his fixed place in realism.
He says to Yoo Sangah, "It is okay, Yoo Sangah. Huh, it won't work even if you tell me the app. The genre of my life was obviously realism."
He rejects her offer of help, a perfectly conventional, helpful gesture within the realism system, because he is absolutely convinced his life genre is fixed, and fixed is realism, a genre where such tools and efforts are either futile for him or belong to a different narrative path he cannot access.
Her app is for her genre, not his.
Exactly. Her apps, her methods, represent a pathway to conventional success and self-improvement, tools perfectly suited for climbing the ladder in the realism corporate world, a genre he feels fundamentally excluded from and unsuccessful in. He sees her tools as useless to him because, in his mind, his narrative path is set in realism, a path that, for him, only leads to being a normal, single, and lonely man whose contract is ending.
And then he makes this fixed self-categorization explicit, drawing on the dual meaning of his name and connecting it to his perceived status. Dokja has a solo life. Huh, what? I am just someone like that. In this genre, I wasn't a protagonist, but a solo person.
This is a powerful, poignant act of self-definition, happening right before that definition is shattered. He connects his name, Dokja, only son reader, directly to his perceived status and identity within the realism genre as solo.
What does solo really imply here?
This term solo carries weight. It means alone, not part of a pair or group, isolated. Crucially, in the context of narrative, it implies someone who doesn't have the typical relationships or spotlight of a protagonist, someone who exists on the periphery. He defines himself by his solitude and his perceived lack of narrative importance within his current reality.
I am just someone like that. Such resignation.
It's a statement of resignation, self-acceptance of his non-protagonist role in this specific story. This self-labeling is crucial because his unique knowledge and subsequent power come precisely because he was solo, an observer, a reader standing apart from the main events of the novel he consumed, rather than a character caught up in its world.
Yoo Sangah's reaction to this is one of clear concern, even if he dismisses it. The life of a solo. Yoo Sangah had a serious expression on her face. However, I waved my hands to show it was really okay. I didn't know why, but this person was really worried about me. Maybe because she was part of the personnel department.
He sees her serious expression, her worry, but he immediately dismisses it, perhaps out of ingrained solitude, social awkwardness, or a belief that she couldn't possibly understand his perspective.
He even chalks her worry up to her role in HR.
Right. Framing her concern as a professional obligation rather than genuine human connection, reinforcing his sense of isolation even when someone expresses worry. It really highlights his self-imposed distance from others, his acceptance of his solitary status.
And she responds with her own moment of self-definition, one that contrasts sharply with his. She says, "Dokja is really good? Yes. Then I will live an ivory life."
The ivory life. Sangha means ivory.
Exactly. She declares she will live an ivory life, suggesting something refined, valuable, pure, perhaps even beautiful, but also hard, polished, potentially isolated, or focused on its own perfect, unchanging path.
It's a contrasting self-definition to his solo life, highlighting their different aspirations, different self-perceptions, and the distinct nature of the genres they believe they inhabit.
And after all this heavy internal thought, this stark confrontation with his perceived reality and his rejection of conventional help, he tries to return to his usual refuge, his escape.
Back to the phone.
Yoo Sangah seemed to have decided something as she turned back to studying Spanish. I gazed at her for a while before returning to the novel. Everything had returned to normal, but strangely, my scrolling of the novel didn't go well. Maybe it was because I realized the weight of reality that I couldn't scroll down.
This moment perfectly captures the tension between his desire for escape and the pressing burden of his perceived reality. He attempts to re-enter his fictional world, his usual refuge from the pressures and failures of realism, but he physically cannot.
The weight of reality.
The weight of reality, the looming job loss, his perceived failure, his status as a solo non-protagonist, the confirmation of the different genre Yoo Sangah inhabits is pressing down on him, preventing him from escaping into the story. It's a physical manifestation of his internal conflict.
The act of not being able to scroll down is a powerful modern symbol. The barrier between his mundane life and the fictional world he usually accesses so easily with a simple swipe is suddenly solidifying, becoming impenetrable because the perceived weight of his reality is too heavy, too demanding to allow for simple escapism.
And this barrier, this perceived separation between his realism life and the fictional world, is about to be violently broken, but not in the way he might have passively wished for. The story isn't just waiting for him to access it. The story is coming to him.
Okay, so let's take one final moment to consolidate everything we've covered before the chapter's explosive climax. We've seen Dokja firmly reject Yoo Sangah's offer of conventional help, rooted in his strong conviction that his life is and will remain confined to the realism genre, where he defines himself as a solo person, fundamentally a non-protagonist.
This self-categorization is directly linked to his name, Dokja. Yoo Sangah contrasts this with her own declaration of living an ivory life, representing a different, conventionally successful path.
We've seen Dokja try to return to his comforting web novel, only to find he can't scroll, physically and mentally weighed down by the reality he believes is unchangeable and inescapable.
The vivid imagery here is the feeling of the heavy, stagnant air in the subway car, the physical weight of his phone suddenly resistant to his touch, symbolizing the crushing burden of his perceived realism reality, contrasting with the lightness of the fictional world he can no longer access in that moment.
Remember, Dokja defines himself as a realism solo, contrasting with Sangah's ivory life, and his inability to scroll symbolizes the barrier between his old reality and the stories he reads, a barrier that is about to be violently broken.
And it's precisely at this moment of internal conflict, of being unable to escape into fiction due to the suffocating weight of his perceived reality, that the external intervention occurs. The catalyst arrives, not from his attempts to scroll, but from the system itself.
At that time, a notification appeared at the top of my smartphone. You have one new mail.
Right on cue.
It was from the author of Ways of Survival. I opened the mail.
The timing here is absolutely impeccable, almost cruelly precise. Just as the barrier between reality and fiction feels most insurmountable for Dokja, just as he feels most trapped by the weight of reality, a direct line opens up from the source of the fiction itself, the author of the very novel he reads.
It's the call coming from inside the house, or the story.
Exactly. This is the literal intervention, the catalyst for the genre shift, coming directly from the world he's been escaping into.
And the content of this email is immediately packed with world-altering significance. Reader Nim, my novel will become paid from 7 p.m. This will be helpful. Good luck. One attachment.
This email is dense with meaning. Reader Nim, it's a formal, respectful way the author addresses him,
Acknowledging his identity.
validating his role as a reader, perhaps even hinting at the deep connection between author and dedicated reader. The notification that the novel will become paid from 7 p.m. isn't just a detail about the fictional novel's monetization within its own world. It's explicitly tied to the exact moment the real world will transform.
It links money, value, story, and reality changing.
It links the economic structure of the web novel platform, the point where a story gains value and earns money, to the literal transformation of reality into a system where actions will likely have tangible, earned consequences.
And the phrases, this will be helpful, good luck.
Massive, monumental understatements delivered with an almost dry, nonchalant tone that is chilling in retrospect, considering the unspeakable horror and chaos that are about to be unleashed.
And the one attachment.
That is the key, the source of his unique, life-saving information, the culmination of a decade of solitary reading.
And Dokja's immediate reaction reveals the core of his character, his defining passion. The author said he would give me a gift. What was the gift? Like my name, I was also a reader by nature, so I was excited to receive the mail. Yes, it wasn't bad living as a reader.
He's excited about receiving a gift from the author he's followed for 10 years, despite the story's unpopularity. This reinforces that his reader identity, his connection to this fictional world, is absolutely central to who he is.
He finds value and affirmation in living as a reader just moments before that identity pays off in the most extreme, terrifying way imaginable.
It highlights the depth of his connection to this specific story and its creator, a connection forged in solitude over a decade of dedicated reading. This wasn't bad living as a reader. The line isn't just a throwaway thought. It feels like a quiet affirmation of his life's path.
The path he just felt was leading nowhere.
Immediately validated by the universe itself, albeit in a terrifying, unexpected manner.
The timing is emphasized again, highlighting the convergence. I checked the time. It was 6:55 p.m. I had exactly 5 minutes before the novel became monetized at 7 p.m.
The countdown begins. This countdown, framed around the novel's monetization time, directly links the commercial transition of the story to the impending apocalyptic event. The clock is ticking down to the moment fiction becomes reality.
And his immediate impulse, before checking the attachment, is a deeply human one for a dedicated fan.
What does he do?
Then I opened up my list of preferred novels in the app. Since I was the only reader, I should leave a congratulatory comment and give strength to the author.
Wow, that confirms a critical detail.
Yeah.
He was the only reader who stuck with and finished the entire novel, Ways of Survival. This solitary persistence, this dedication to an unpopular, perhaps unfinished feeling story, is precisely why he possesses the unique knowledge that no one else in the world has.
And he just wants to say thanks.
His desire to leave a congratulatory comment, a simple gesture of support for the author, despite the story's lack of popularity, shows the genuine human connection he felt to the creator of the world he inhabited as a reader.
But as he goes to leave that comment, he discovers the first sign that the rules are already changing, that the boundaries are dissolving. The work doesn't exist.
Go on.
I tried typing ruins several times in the search box, but the result was the same. The bulletin board for Ways of Survival had disappeared without a trace. It was strange. Had there ever been a case of a novel being deleted without notification when it was going to be monetized?
This is the first major glitch in the system of his reality, the first impossible event within the context of the mundane world. The novel isn't just ending or becoming paid, it's vanishing from the platform entirely, leaving no trace.
It's like the story is leaving its container.
Exactly. It's as if the distinction between the story and reality is dissolving. Or rather, the story is leaving its container because it's about to move into the real world. The vessel holding the story, the app, the bulletin board, is breaking down because the story itself is relocating. It's a deeply unsettling event within the context of the app before the true horror begins outside his phone screen.
And that's when it happens, right at the precise moment of 7 p.m., the monetization time, the signal that the story is gaining value and moving. At that moment, the subway lights turned off and the inside of the train became dark. Keek. The subway train shook loudly and let out a metallic sound.
The sensory details here are immediate, visceral, and terrifying. The sudden plunge into darkness, the loss of all familiar visual cues, followed by the violent shaking, the screeching of metal on metal.
Absolute chaos erupting from stillness.
A violent tearing of the fabric of their mundane reality. The loss of light is deeply symbolic. The familiar world they inhabit is going dark, being extinguished. The physical violence of the shaking train mirrors the violent, fundamental shaking of their perceived reality.
It caused Yoo Sangah to scream and grab my arm. Then I heard the sound of other people getting stirred up. Yoo Sangah gripped my arm so tightly that I paid more attention to the pain in my left arm than the sudden stop.
Her reaction is the universal human response to sudden, terrifying chaos, screaming, reaching out, clinging to the nearest person. This human, fearful response from the realism character contrasts sharply with Dokja's perhaps detached, shock-induced, or pragmatically focused internal monologue.
Noting the pain in his arm more than the catastrophe.
Her physical clinging to him is deeply symbolic. The character who embodies conventional realism grasping desperately onto the character who is secretly defined by his knowledge of fiction as their shared world collapses. The sound of other people getting stirred up establishes the shared experience of terror and the unknown that sweeps through the carriage.
And Dokja's immediate, almost instinctive reaction is to try and force the situation back into the framework of realism.
She tries to normalize it.
Yeah. I pretended to be unconcerned. Don't worry, it isn't a big deal. Is that so? Yes, it is probably a disturbance from a suicide. The engineer will soon make an announcement. He tries to apply a common, albeit grim, explanation for subway delays in the real world, a disturbance, a suicide.
He's desperately attempting to frame this utterly impossible event, using the rules and explanations of the old realism genre he felt trapped in. He's trying to maintain the illusion of the old reality, to explain the unexplainable with mundane, albeit dark, reasons.
Okay, let's take just a moment before the final lines, the absolute turning point. We've traced Dokja's journey from a reader perceiving his life as a realism solo to receiving a fateful email from the author of his favorite unpopular web novel.
This email announces monetization at 7 p.m. and offers a mysterious gift, confirming his unique status as the novel's only dedicated reader.
Trying to engage with the novel's community, he discovers it has vanished from the app, an impossible glitch in his familiar digital world.
Then, precisely at 7 p.m., matching the novel's monetization time, the subway plunges into darkness, shaking violently with a terrifying screech of metal.
Passengers panic, and Yoo Sangah, embodying the realism life he felt separate from, instinctively grabs his arm. Dokja's immediate response is to try and explain the chaos using mundane, if dark, reasons, clinging to the framework of the old realism genre, even as it disintegrates around him.
The vivid imagery here captures the sudden, jarring transition. The plunge into darkness, the screeching metal, the feeling of Sangah's desperate grip on his arm, and Dokja's phone screen with the email notification, the last link to the world that is about to merge terrifyingly with his own.
Remember, 7 p.m. is the pivot point. The author's email is the key, the novel disappearing signals the shift, and Dokja's mundane explanation is his final, futile attempt to cling to the collapsing realism world.
And his attempt to ground this situation in realism is immediately, unequivocally shattered by the true nature of the event.
As I finished speaking, I heard the engineer's announcement, telling all passengers on the train. The loud surroundings became calm.
For a fleeting second, Dokja's prediction holds true within the old framework. The familiar, authoritative sound of the engineer's voice attempting a routine announcement brings a momentary sense of calm, a false hope that they are returning to normal.
A severe but mundane delay.
But that calm is violently, grotesquely broken.
Dokja thinks. I sighed and opened my mouth. See, it isn't a big deal. Now an apology will air and the power will come back on.
And then the announcement continues. Everyone run away! Run! What?
The engineer's message is corrupted, panicked, breaking down into a desperate, illogical instruction. Everyone run away! Run!
This is the definitive break from realism. It's a human voice, filled with terror, but delivering an absurd, non-standard instruction for a subway delay. It signals that this is not a malfunction, not a routine emergency, but something fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong.
Dokja's simple what is his final moment of disbelief, his last anchor to the old reality, before being forced to confront the utterly impossible new one.
Then the source of the true event reveals itself, announced by sounds that are alien and mechanical.
There was a beeping sound and the broadcast turned off. The inside of the train became a mess. Dokja, see, what is this? A bright light flashed from the front of the subway train. There was a loud drumming sound followed by a pop. Something was heading this way in the darkness.
The details escalate the terror rapidly. The cold, mechanical beeping of the system taking over, the human broadcast being cut off, the growing mess and panic inside the train, a terrifying bright light, drumming sounds, a pop.
All indicating that something non-human, something powerful and dangerous is approaching rapidly in the darkness. This is the physical manifestation of the genre shift arriving.
The buildup is a masterclass in creating immediate horror. From the quiet, mundane conversation to the sudden violent stop, the attempt to explain it away with mundane reasons, and then the corrupted, panicked broadcast, followed by the terrifying sensory input of the approaching entity.
It's a rapid, relentless descent into the unknown, leaving no space for the characters or the reader to breathe.
And at this precise climactic moment, the narrative explicitly links the timeline back to the email, confirming the convergence of story and reality.
Dokja notices. It was just a coincidence that I saw the clock at this moment, 7 p.m. Tick, it felt like the world was stopping.
For us, the readers who just saw the email stating the novel would become paid at 7 p.m., and for Dokja, who was uniquely aware of that time, seeing the clock strike 7 p.m. at the exact second of this monstrous arrival confirms the horrific, impossible convergence.
Fiction isn't just reflecting reality, it's becoming it, right on schedule.
Tick, it felt like the world was stopping. Captures that feeling of time freezing, that final fraction of a second before a reality-altering event fundamentally changes everything.
And then, the voice that matters. Not the engineer's voice, not a human voice filled with panic, but a voice that is cold, impersonal, seemingly omniscient.
The voice of the new ruling power, the system that has just taken over, the voice of the new genre.
The free service of Planetary System 8612 has been terminated. The main scenario has started.
Let's break down this declaration because every phrase is significant. The free service of Planetary System 8612 has been terminated.
This language is chillingly corporate, digital, utterly devoid of human warmth. It treats an entire planet, perhaps an entire solar system, not as a home or a world, but as a service.
Planetary System 8612 implies Earth is just one numerical node in a vast governed network, one among potentially countless others.
And the free service has been terminated.
It implies that their previous reality, the mundane world of realism they knew, was merely a trial period, a state of grace, a period of existence without cost or control, which is now over. Reality is now being framed as a paid subscription, a service with rules, limitations, and devastating costs that are about to become brutally clear.
And the main scenario has started.
This is the explicit, undeniable confirmation of the genre shift. This isn't a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, or an alien invasion as conventionally understood. It's the beginning of a main scenario, using language pulled directly from gaming, role-playing, or narrative structures.
Reality is now operating according to a plot line.
With objectives, challenges, antagonists, and stakes, all governed by system rules that the characters, except for one, are completely unaware of. This definitively confirms Dokja's earlier contemplation. His life's genre has changed, dramatically, violently, and irreversibly, from realism to something structured like a narrative game.
And the chapter ends with his powerful, concise, concluding internal thought that brings everything full circle, confirming his earlier, seemingly metaphorical musings. This was the moment the genre of my life changed.
His earlier thoughts about himself being stuck in realism, about others belonging to different genres, about whether he could ever be a protagonist in a fantasy world, they weren't just metaphors or wishful thinking. They were prescient observations about the fundamental nature of his reality.
The world he knew is gone.
Replaced by a terrifying, system-driven fantasy apocalypse governed by narrative rules that he, uniquely, is intimately familiar with because he spent years reading about them. This ending is the perfect, explosive, inciting incident.
All the preceding elements, his unique name and identity as a reader, his self-perception as a solo outsider in the realism genre, his contrast with Yoo Sangah and her conventional success.
The deep irony of his undervalued reading hobby, the email from the author, the novel's disappearance, the terrifying sensory details of the subway stopping all converge in this single, dramatic, chilling announcement.
It immediately propels the story into its core premise,
making it undeniably clear that Kim Dokja's seemingly useless hobby of reading web novels, his solitary dedication to following an unpopular story to its end, is now, in this main scenario, the only thing that can possibly guide him. It confirms that the life he thought was defined by failure and solitude was actually the perfect, necessary preparation for the end of the world.
Thinking back to our branching path diagram one last time.
The 7 p.m. announcement is the force that doesn't just nudge Dokja, but violently shoves him off the realism path and onto the fantasy path, a path he's uniquely equipped to navigate, because he's already read the map, the entire story of ways of survival.
Wow. It's incredible how much dense setup, character insight, and thematic groundwork is packed into these first few pages. Just the first chapter, and the entire foundation for a metafictional system apocalypse is laid.
All starting with the quietest character, a reader, on a subway. It leaves you breathless.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's do a mega recap of everything we've unpacked from Chapter 1 of Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint.
It's not just an introduction, but a masterclass in establishing a complex premise and a unique protagonist. It introduces Kim Dokja, whose very name foreshadows his dual nature as an only son of a specific fate and a reader of countless others' fates.
Immediately establishing his solitary yet uniquely insightful identity.
We see him define himself, within the confines of what he perceives as the mundane realism genre of his life, as a solo person, an observer defined by his perceived failures, impending job loss, loneliness, and his solitary hobby of reading web novels.
This self-perception is sharply contrasted with Yoo Sangah, whom he views as the embodiment of conventional success and a protagonist in the realism world, living what she calls an ivory life.
His unique status as the only person to finish the massively long web novel Ways of Survival is subtly hinted at through his interaction with its author via email, an email that arrives precisely as he is struggling with the weight of reality and his inability to escape into fiction.
The chapter builds tension through this internal struggle and the external strangeness of the novel vanishing from its platform, culminating in the sudden, violent disruption of the subway at 7 p.m., the novel's stated monetization time.
The final, chilling system announcement. The free service of Planetary System 8612 has been terminated. The main scenario has started. Explicitly declares the genre shift, transforming mundane reality into a narrative governed by cold external forces.
Every single detail in this chapter, from the protagonist's name and hobby to his perception of others and his final, desperate attempt to cling to normalcy, is meticulously crafted to establish that Kim Dokja's previously undervalued solitary life as a reader is now his singular ultimate advantage in this terrifying new world.
His weakness has become his strength.
Okay, to sum all of this up into some key points you can take away, like some flashcards for the apocalypse.
First up, protagonist's name, Kim Dokja. Crucially meaning only son and reader.
Yeah.
Remember that duality.
Dokja's perceived initial genre, realism, where he sees himself as a solo non-protagonist.
Dokja's defining hobby, reading web novels on the subway, his secret source of power.
Key novel, Ways of Survival, author, Sing Shangchang, the story that becomes reality.
Dokja's unique status, the only person who finished Ways of Survival after a decade of rooting it. Solitude equals knowledge.
Contrasting character. Yoo Sangah, seen by Dokja as a realism protagonist, embodying conventional success, lives an ivory life, studies Spanish, reads literary fiction.
Inciting incident. The convergence of the email from the Ways of Survival author, the novel disappearing from the app, and the subway stopping violently, all happening precisely at 7 p.m.
Defining announcement. The free service of Planetary System 8612 has been terminated. The main scenario has started. The system's declaration of the genre shift.
The core transformation. Reality shifts from realism to fantasy system apocalypse, following narrative rules.
Dokja's advantage. His encyclopedic knowledge of Ways of Survival gained through his solitary reading. That's his superpower.
Thinking critically about this explosive first chapter, here's some deeper questions to mull over or explore on your own.
First, what is the psychological significance of Kim Dokja's name, particularly its dual meaning? How does this duality shape his internal conflict and his external identity as perceived by others and by himself, especially his feeling of being a solo?
Second, how does the author establish the contrast between realism and fantasy before the genre shift even occurs? What specific details, from his hobby to his observations of others and his internal monologues, reveal Dokja's pre-existing understanding of narrative structures and genres, and how does this make him uniquely prepared?
Third, analyze Dokja's interaction with Yoo Sangah in detail. Beyond just contrasting their hobbies and careers, what specific lines or actions reveal his social anxiety, his views on conventional success versus his own life, and the implications of the genre concept he applies to her? Is his categorization of her entirely accurate, or does it reflect his own biases and insecurities?
Fourth, why is the detail of Dokja being the only reader of Ways of Survival so fundamentally important to the premise of the novel? What does this imply about the value of solitary dedication, niche knowledge, unpopular stories, and preparation in this narrative? How does his loneliness become a strength?
Fifth, deconstruct the language of the final system announcement. The free service terminated. The main scenario has started. What does this corporate digital language suggest about the nature of the new world's governing forces, their view of humanity or planets, and the structure of reality itself under their rule? How does this compare to the language of conventional fantasy or sci-fi?
And finally, sixth, consider Dokja's internal struggle to scroll down his novel pages just before the change. What does this physical inability to escape into the story symbolize about the psychological barrier between his old reality and the story world he seeks refuge in? And how does the system's sudden arrival violently break that barrier, not by letting him in, but by bringing the story out to him?
It's truly incredible how much is packed into these first few pages, setting the stage for a massive story by focusing on a single, seemingly unremarkable character's internal world colliding with an unimaginable external event.
It really is.
It leaves you with so much to think about stories, about reality, and about where you fit in the narrative of your own life.
And it poses that ultimate question right at the start. If your reality suddenly became governed by narrative rules, if life literally became a story, would the story you've consumed save you? Or would they trap you within a script you never expected to perform?